Abindar gave the signal. 4 soldiers moved in closely around the prisoners and began to strip them of their clothes. A murmurous sound came up from the people below. The crucifixion had begun. When the prisoners were naked, a cloth was wound around their loins and between the thighs, with the loose end tucked in at the back. Their clothes and sandals were set in a loose pile before each of the 3. The time was a few minutes after noon. The sun was high and warm. Below the big bald rock, the leaves of the olive trees and the wildflowers shimmered in a soft breeze. Coveys of little swifts darted across the rock and down into the garden below, there to peck for food and to keep a wary eye on man. At the first murmur from the crowd, they took flight. The executioner laid the crossbeam behind Jesus and brought him to the ground quickly by grasping his arm and pulling him backward. As soon as Jesus fell, the beam was fitted under the back of his neck, and on each side, soldiers quickly knelt on the inside of the elbows. Jesus gave no resistance and said nothing, but he groaned as he fell on the back of his head, and the thorns pressed against his torn scalp. Once begun, the matter was done quickly and efficiently. The executioner wore an apron with pockets. He placed 2 5-inch nails between his teeth and, hammer in hand, knelt beside the right arm. The soldier, whose knee rested on the inside of the elbow, held the forearm flat to the board. With his right hand, the executioner probed the wrist of Jesus to find a little hollow spot. When he found it, he took one of the square-cut iron nails from his teeth and held it against the spot, directly behind where the so-called lifeline ends. Then he raised the hammer over the nail head and brought it down with force. At the foot of the hill, John held Mary's head against his bosom, both to comfort her and so that she could not see. Among the spectators, many turned away. Some cried, some prayed aloud, some walked away toward the Geneth gate. The executioner jumped across the body to the other wrist. As soon as he was satisfied that the condemned man could not, in struggling, pull himself loose and perhaps fall forward off the cross, he brought both of his arms upward rapidly. This was the signal to lift the crossbeam. 2 soldiers grabbed each side of the crossbeam and lifted. As they pulled up, they dragged Jesus by the wrists. With every breath he groaned. When the soldiers reached the upright, the 4 of them began to lift the crossbeam higher until the feet of Jesus were off the ground. The body must have writhed with pain. The 4 men pushed upward until the mortise hole was over the upright. The 2 thieves who had been watching looked away. The silent one found his voice again and began to pray in murmurs. The other one cried and appealed to the 4 guards around him that this was all a mistake as far as he was concerned. One high priest looked at another and said that this was a very poor example of a Messiah. In his time, he had seen better. When the crossbeam was set firmly, the executioner reached up and set the board which listed the name of the prisoner and the crime. Then he knelt before the cross. 2 soldiers hurried to help, and each one took hold of a leg at the calf. The ritual was to nail the right foot over the left, and this was probably the most difficult part of the work. If the feet were pulled downward and nailed close to the foot of the cross, the prisoner always died quickly. Over the years, the Romans learned to push the feet upward on the cross, so that the condemned man could lean on the nails and stretch himself upward. Jesus was crucified. He faced the holy city for the last time. The workmen moved to the others and went through the same ritual with each one. To the watching crowd in front, death appeared to come slowly astride the shoulders of fatigue. The 4 wounds in themselves were not fatal, but the constant pain forced the dying men to move in agony. The spectators observed Jesus closely, because the high priest had passed the word that this was a mock Messiah, and that part of his crime was saying that if the great temple were destroyed, he could raise it in 3 days. To the strangers, Jesus looked like any other pain-racked criminal they had ever seen. To the casual viewer, there was nothing different about him or unusual. Like the others, his head at times was lowered, with chin touching chest. Again, moved by sudden spasms, his head tossed from one shoulder to the other, and his eyes looked directly up into the sun as his lips moved. When his body sagged in fatigue, its weight hung on the nails in his wrists, and his knees bent far forward. His arms were now in a V position, and Jesus became conscious of 2 unendurable circumstances. The first was that the pain in his wrists was beyond bearing, and that muscle cramps knotted his forearms and upper arms and the pads of his shoulders. The second was that his pectoral muscles at the sides of his chest were momentarily paralysed. This induced him into involuntary panic, for he found that while he could draw air into his lungs, he was powerless to exhale. At once, Jesus raised himself on his bleeding feet. As the weight of his body came down on the insteps, the single nail pressed hard against the top of the wound. Slowly, steadily, Jesus was forced to raise himself higher until, for the moment, his head hid the sign which told of his cry. When his shoulders were on a level with his hands, breathing was rapid and easier. Like the other 2, he fought the pain in his feet in order to breathe rapidly for a few moments. Then, unable to bear the pain below, which cramped his legs and thighs and wrung moans from the strongest, he let his torso sag lower and lower, and his knees projected a little at a time, until, with a deep sigh, he felt himself to be hanging by the wrists, and this process must have been repeated again and again. Now, at the end, Jesus again pulled himself up to the top of his cross. Again he spoke. "Father," he cried, "into your hands I commit my spirit." One of the soldiers came around to the front of the cross to take a look. Then he went back and lay down on the rock. From Jesus' lungs came a final cry. "It is finished." The body sagged on the cross. Jesus willed himself to die.